Welcome to the Quantum Healthy Podcast. I'm Andia, a licensed addiction counselor, and along with my co-host, Laura Kissman, a quantum nutritionist, we will be inviting expert scientists, clinicians, survivors, and thrivers to distill their pearls of wisdom attained from applying quantum biology to their fields of research and everyday lives. Our goal is to bring you easy to understand principles and practices about the study of light, water, and magnetism so you can take your health into your own hands. This episode is sponsored by Viva Rays, the only eyewear company that truly understands your biology. Viva Rays are advanced blue light glasses designed with circadian biology in mind. Unlike typical blue blockers, they filter light in harmony with your body's natural rhythms, helping you sleep deeper, feel more energized, and protect your long-term health. We love companies that support biology-backed wellness, and Viva Rays is leading the way. Use code QuantumHealthy at vivarays.com to save 15% and support your sleep, focus, and natural energy the way nature intended. Enjoy this episode. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Quantum Healthy Podcast. We have a very exciting guest today. Gerald Pollack is with us, and he is a professor of bioengineering at the University of Washington. He is the founding editor-in-chief of the journal Water, executive director of the Institute of Venture Science, and founder of the annual conference on physics, chemistry, and the biology of water. You've published over 300 papers and authored several books, including, at least in our space, the very popular Cells, Gels, and the Engines of Life, and the fourth phase of water. So welcome to our podcast, Jerry.
Well, thanks to both of you for the invitation. I really appreciate it, and I'm delighted and thrilled to be with you.
Awesome. Well, we thought we would start it off with you sharing a little bit on how an electrical engineering student becomes a renowned water researcher.
And prolific writer.
Yes.
Well, that's a good question. You know, it's a question I haven't really thought about a whole lot. So I studied true electrical engineering as an undergraduate student, and I I never thought I'd do anything with it. I went to graduate school and studied biomedical engineering, and I wound up at the University of Washington, where I am now. And my interest for quite a few years was muscle contraction, how the molecules, actin, myosin, and other molecules interact to produce force and motion. And I was happily doing that. And the work was exciting. I'm not sure how much traction I really gained in that field because my nemesis was a famous scientist, Sir Andrew Huxley. And Sir Andrew, he was part of the Huxley family, you know, a distinguished family, Aldous Huxley, Thomas Henry Huxley. He won a Nobel Prize. He was president of the Royal Society, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Unfortunately, his theory was wrong. I say that blatantly because it simply didn't fit the evidence. But, you know, he was so distinguished that he would walk into a room, and when he'd walk into a room, it was like God has just walked into the room. So there was a hush. And I came to realize that no matter how strong was your challenge and how meaningful was your challenge, if you're up against someone like that, you won't succeed because he is so distinguished that many other people in the field, rather than succumb to what appears to be truth, they rather acquiesce to the views of so important a person, you know. And so I learned something of sociology. I also learned that he was a rather lonely man, and I learned that this is to my great surprise because, you know, such a distinguished man. And it was early in my career that with some trepidation, I went to London to show him our evidence. We had 3 different experiments, all 3 of which, any one of which would demonstrate his theory is all wet. It doesn't make sense. So I gathered my strength, my emotional strength, and I approached him. I remember I was sitting outside his building. I arrived 30 minutes early and scared to death, meeting the great man. And he was very cordial. He invited me in. He ran up the stairs 2 steps at a time and went down 2 steps at a time also. So we went into his office and we spent 3 hours. And he was really, really curious about everything that we had found. And he asked many questions. And this was a really good scientific discussion. I doubt that I convinced him of anything, but he did listen and he asked many questions. And then after 3 hours, he turns around and there's a little small piece of furniture behind him, a cabinet of some sort. He opens the cabinet and pulls out a bottle of brandy, I think it was, and pours it, a glass for him, a glass for me. And there was a student of his who was sitting nearby, and I realized he so enjoyed this scientific discussion, even though he might not have liked what we were presenting. But I realized nobody would challenge this guy. He was too important, you know? Nobody challenges God. You don't simply go into a room and say, "Hey God, I've got I've got some material here and it doesn't agree with your point of view." You simply don't do that. And so for me, people come to me, "You're all wet. I don't believe this. I don't believe that." No, but God, God doesn't get challenged that way. And I realized he enjoyed it so much for being a human being and having a real scientific discussion that the poor guy is living in an ivory tower. And
Mhm.
nobody approaches the great guru in the ivory tower. So the upshot of the whole thing, I learned something about the sociology. And if you get to be in the scientific realm, if you get to be a godlike figure, you're lonely. Nobody would challenge you. And and this is a problem because, if you're serious about finding scientific truth, then there's got to be debate.
Mhm.
You've got two different points of view. You argue the points of view, and in theory, the better, the more accurate point of view is going to win out. And that's the usual, but not if you're God.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so his theory prevails even today, and no challenge at all. It's in every textbook, and the central idea now is so pervasive, it applies to so many systems, even beyond muscle contraction, anything that moves or generates motion of some sort. That's the theory that's invoked. But there's so much that doesn't fit the theory. And I wrote a book in 1990 about muscle contraction,
Mhm.
and I realized that practically everybody in the field has a copy, but almost nobody's read it. I, I, I remember visiting a colleague. I'm sitting in his office, and I look on his shelf. And oh, hey, there's my book, Muscles and Molecules. So he pulls it out, and he opens it, and it sort of cracks open. And so this is the first time it's been ever been opened. He got the
Oh.
book, but not interested in reading it because we all know we have to cater to the master. We see that a little bit in politics today, but it's not so different in science, the sociology of science. Anyway, you asked me a question and I couldn't hesitate. I helped but tell you the story of the late Sir Andrew Huxley, whose
Who
view
is is it his grandfather or uncle that is Aldous Huxley, Brave New World, the
half,
author?
I think a cousin or half.
Okay.
Why am I thinking half something? Yeah, I can't remember. And then I think Thomas Henry Huxley, the great biologist, I think his grandfather or something like this. But he's the only one who won a Nobel Prize. And he won it for his work on membranes. And well, I guess I I hesitate to say, but I think that his ideas in that realm are not correct either. But this is another story, and you know, I I I don't want to come across as saying, "Oh, I know everything and he knows nothing." That's not exactly what. So it's just that if you look at the evidence produced by other people and some by us, it doesn't fit. And when it doesn't fit, you have to ask whether the emperor has no clothes. Um, that's the way it goes. So I learned something in those younger days, and I learned that it's not just the facts that count. The sociology counts as well. And
Interesting.
so
And
anyway,
how science can just take so long to change because the sociology of us all thinking that this someone is God, right? Or I was in the Air Force, so the whole analogy of him walking in the room, that was us all standing to attention when the general walks in, and you don't
Oh, I can imagine.
question the general, right?
Yeah, it's pretty much the same thing.
Mhm.
You don't question the general. The general knows what he or she is talking about, and
Mhm.
that's it. It maybe is designed to be a bit more strict in the military regime. The scientific, it's not supposed to be. It's supposed to be the opposite. It's supposed to be completely open and open discussion, and
Mhm.
the facts win. But it doesn't always work that way.
Well, Jerry, that actually is a great segue into the next thing we want to talk about because it makes sense to me why you would see the like how something isn't working out or the theory is wrong or however you want to word that because of your work on it with easy water. So, do you want to share with the audience? I mean, we have had a couple of conversations on water, but I think this will be really cool for people to hear from you. What is easy?
Easy to remember.
Yeah.
It's true.
And there's a measure of truth to that. Easy actually stands for exclusion zone. It's a zone zone of water that we looked at that tends to exclude any foreign particles or molecules. And so someone's asked after we began doing experiments and identified this zone of water, some Australian colleagues said, oh, you ought to give it a name instead of running through this elaborate description. Just call it something. He said, call it exclusion zone because it's a zone that excludes and it's easy to remember. It doesn't work in some countries where it's EZ, but
That's my country.
yeah. And so just last funny thing, just last week, a friend of mine sent me a photograph that she took at the airport. And, after you go through security, you can't take water through security, but after security, now they have some machines that you can use to fill your water bottle. And and she took a photograph of the machine and it said easy water on the machine. So I would and I took a trip right after that, a few days after, and I went through San Francisco and Phoenix and one other airport, and I saw the same machines there. So I guess I don't I don't really know if they have easy water, but anyway, they advertise it as easy water. I was kind of interested to see that. Okay,
Wouldn't
but
that be something?
well, yeah, something, but
Something or wrong if it's not really easy.
well, I
Well,
don't.
yeah, like wouldn't that be something if we had negatively charged water coming out, like
Ah,
what we need, right? But it's
It'd be good for
mislabeled.
you. Good for your health. But
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure that the company is really producing easy water. I've seen no
No.
evidence, but they might be. I don't know. But it was just a curious observation. Okay,
Hmm.
so but I need to go back, and start at the beginning. So I was in a completely different field, the muscle contraction. I went to a meeting. The meeting was in Hungary, and it was to commemorate the work, a memorial symposium of a Hungarian biophysicist whose name was Ernst. And Ernst had two interests. One is muscle contraction, and the other one is water. And and so I was asked to come and present about muscle contraction, which is what I was doing. And I did my thing, and I guess it went okay. But then came a guy named Gilbert Ling, uh,
Mm.
who presented on water. And you're nodding your head. You know of the work of Gilbert Ling. What you might not know is that Gilbert came as in the first cohort of Chinese scholars to come and study in the U.S. And there were four of them, and three of the four won Nobel Prizes. So, this it was quite a distinguished group, and many who know Gilbert Ling's work, their opinions are that he should have won two Nobel Prizes for his contribution. So what was his contribution? Well, his contribution was he said that the water inside the cell is not like liquid water. It's not like this stuff sitting in the glass. How's it different? He said it's different and provided enormous amounts of evidence. He said the molecules of water are stacked like soldiers at attention. Being a former military person, you understand that.
Sure
Soldiers,
do.
like soldiers at attention, they're kind of lined up. And if you think about each water molecule being dipole in structure, like a bean with plus at one end and minus at the other end, you can understand how one would stack upon another, negative next to positive. They can just stack. And the standard point of view is that at surfaces, the water molecules can indeed stack maybe one or two molecular layers, but Gilbert was saying, oh no, it's not one or two layers. It actually could be hundreds, if not thousands. And what we found is sometimes millions. I mean, this is something that is macroscopic. And so I was intrigued. I heard what Gilbert Ling had to say, and I find myself easily impressed by interesting ideas. So I didn't trust myself. I was really blown away by the amount of evidence that he had. So I went home. I came home back to Seattle. I got one of his books, and I gave one of his books to some of my students. Hey, what do you think of this stuff? Just threw it out there. And the responses were uniform. They said, well, it looks like if this guy is right, then all of biology is wrong, because biology is based on the idea that inside each cell, the water is like ordinary liquid water. And molecules can diffuse around easily, but if he's right, it's not liquid water at all. It's a different kind of water. He called it structured water. We later had different names for it, including fourth phase water, because every feature of that water differed from ordinary liquid water, every feature that we measured. But we didn't start at first. I listened to those students, and they said, not only is if he's right, not only is all of biology wrong, but also he's provided mounds of evidence in favor of his point of view. So you can't just easily dismiss it. Well, that for me, that sealed that we had to move into water, move from muscle to water. Muscle is interesting and important, but water is maybe even more important. And indeed, we found so we were able to confirm a good deal of what Gilbert Ling had to say, but we went on to find some features that differ from Gilbert Ling and are centrally important for our lives, for our existence. So what were they? Well, the first thing we found is that there is indeed a kind of structure of water, and it's like a liquid crystal. And when liquid crystal forms, it squeezes out or pushes out all contaminants. So we were able to identify a region of water next to certain surfaces that did exactly that, that region that that started from ordinary liquid water and transformed itself to this, what we call easy water, fourth phase water. And as it grew, it pushed out contaminants. That's why we called it exclusion zone. And the surprise came a few years later when when I guess I was the one who decided to check the electrical potential of this kind of water, because I had done work very early in my career measuring the electrical potential of cells, and I knew how to measure electrical potential in very fine regions using an invention of Gilbert Ling himself, a kind of electrode that could be stuck into a cell. You jab the cell, you measure the electrical potential between the inside and the outside, and then you pull out the electrode, and the cell manages to live even after this insult. So, some of my friends in colorful language, they talk about sticking bigger electrodes into a cell. And in his colorful language, my friend says, it's sort of like sticking a telephone pole up your rear end and expecting you to behave normally. But Gilbert Ling's electrode has a tiny point, and you can stick it in and then pull it out, and it works. So I had experience using this, and I figured, well, okay, let's measure the electrical potential of this EZ region or fourth phase region. And to my shock, surprise, instead of being neutral, it was negatively charged. Now, you'd expect it to be neutral because it starts with neutral water. Water is neutral to begin with. And if anything happens to the water, you certainly don't expect something neutral to become negatively charged. If it becomes negatively charged, then there must be a positively charged region somewhere else, because the two, negative and positive, have to add up to zero, because that's what you started with. You can't just invent charge from nothing. So we found next to hydrophilic water-loving surfaces, we found typically, not every time, but typically the water, this easy water or fourth phase water, transitioned into something negatively charged. And beyond that region, so you're starting with a hydrophilic surface, and then comes the easy or fourth phase water, negatively charged, and beyond that, positive charges, just basically situated in the water and bouncing around. Now, if you got negative next to positive, and if they remain separated, you have a
Mhm.
bad. So the I I guess the kind of important finding is is that water can become a battery, and water, and we could demonstrate that if we put one electrode in the negative and one electrode in the positive, and connect the two electrodes to, for example, an LED lamp, we could light the lamp. So we have proof of principle that this battery can really supply current and could supply electrical energy. And of course, question arises, do we, you and I, all of us, could we be using this kind of electrical energy to run our bodies? Electrical energy, it's a good kind of energy. And we found that that was indeed the case. So one thing, one thing we learned is that we get our energy from ATP, this molecule having a high energy phosphate bond. And that is the bond that's been known since, close to 100 years. 1941, a guy named Lippincott found that the molecule ATP has a high energy bond, and that bond surrenders its energy and lets us, that's how we gain energy. That's how our muscles derive energy to lift a load or something, and our nerves supply energy to transmit information, et cetera, et cetera. What's not known, so you'll find that in every book, every cell biology
Mhm.
book tells you about ATP, the source of energy derived from things that we eat, for example. What they don't tell you is that soon after that finding was obtained, another group, of equally prominent group, said, "Oh, Lippincott was wrong. He made a simple arithmetic error, and there is no such thing as a high energy phosphate bond." And that was tested later by two guys whom I know because they're in the muscle contraction field, and they also found experimentally that there was no such thing as a high energy phosphate bond. Doesn't exist. Now, a lot of people are not aware of that. I can tell by the expression on your face that maybe you haven't heard about that, but it's really, really important to follow through. We don't know who is right, the original experimentalist or the challenger or challengers are right, but it's possible, if Lippincott is correct, and perhaps ATP is the source of energy that we have, the main source of energy, or maybe even the exclusive source of energy. But if he's wrong, then must be another source of energy, because you need a source of energy, you
Mhm.
know, to, and and a possibility is that energy comes from electricity, electrical energy. And if you ask me, I can explain to you how we found that indeed this electrical energy is used. We don't know if it's used extensively or if it's used only in the few instances that we've explored. But as you know, I mean, it's really critically important to know where our energy comes from, right? We go skiing and it requires a lot of energy. Where does it come from? So, I mean, there aren't too many questions that are more fundamental than that.
Yeah,
And I would
exactly.
argue that it's not really clear at the moment. It's not as firm as the biology books would
Mhm.
suggest.
And
Might
didn't
be right.
Gilbert Ling do the math and realize and I thought I heard that Gilbert Ling did the math and there's no way ATP could be the source of energy for our whole entire body.
I think he did. He did the math, particularly in terms of membrane pumps. Maybe that's what you're referring to. I know he did that. He was able to demonstrate that for the sodium pump alone, which was the first pump that was discovered, he would poison the cell, so the cell would run out of energy. And under his conditions, the pump appeared to continue to work. And in order for it to continue to work, notwithstanding it's being poisoned, it simply couldn't have enough energy to do it. It was short by about 30 times. And that was when it was thought that there was only one membrane pump. Now there are more than 1,000. So, you have to ask the question, if the cell doesn't have enough energy to run one pump, how is it going to run 1,000 pumps?
Right.
And, and and Gilbert was pretty clear on that, but people have not accepted it because it seems to be fashionable to accept the idea that membranes have pumps and channels, but there are plenty of arguments that paradigm doesn't work at all. And I've written about it several. I'm happy to talk about it, but I'm not sure, what exactly you'd like to be asking. But the whole energy problem needs really serious consideration because there are students maybe being taught completely wrong answers in some of this stuff.
Yeah. Well, there's so many years that that's what has been taught. It's almost like, oh, well, now it's uncomfortable to think in that, I don't know, compartmentalized like way, like everything's a mechanism, a pump, like that was maybe easy to grasp in the human brain. And like now that we know that isn't true, it's like, oh, we all have to learn something new and that is going to change so many things. And it's like an overwhelming thing. Like I've thought about that before, if that's why it hasn't become more main, and it's not in the textbooks yet.
No, it's not in the textbook. It should be in the textbooks
It
because
should be.
Gilbert Ling's work, this was done 30, 40 years ago.
Right.
But, I guess it's the old, uh, it's a sort of akin to the muscle contraction story. If there's a story, even if it's not right, it's familiar. And if it's familiar, it's
Hmm.
easy because people understand it and they can invoke it and use it and they feel comfortable doing that. And someone comes along and say, hey, it's all wrong, can't be right. It feels uncomfortable
Hmm.
to accept that. And so we tend to reject it. And then in terms of the textbooks, the publishers of textbooks, what they want is to sell textbooks. And if the textbooks contain radical information or information that says, well, here's the prevailing view and here's the evidence against the prevailing view, and here's another view, they're not going to sell many textbooks because the medical schools want to buy books that are sort of the quote accepted way of looking at things. And their radical ideas won't sell because the medical schools want to teach what's accepted. So, you
Is
know,
this book in front of us,
yeah.
The Fourth Phase of Water? To me, it reads like a textbook, and it's even better though because it has way more little diagrams and your son's cartoons are incredible in this book. But to me, like, is this in my view, it's going to be a textbook,
Well,
but it's not, right? It's not
I,
accepted?
I,
Yeah.
I don't know if it will be a textbook, but it's very popular on Amazon. If you just take a look,
Hmm.
I mean, most books these days are sold through Amazon, and this one is sold too. And there are reviewer ratings of the books, and if you take a look at the reviewer score, it sometimes if I feel a little bit down in the dumps, I look at the reviews and I feel better. Um, so I don't know if you'd call it a textbook, but yeah, it's meant for wide dissemination.
Yes.
It's meant for people to understand it. In my view, if you can't explain it to your grandmother, then probably something's wrong, and then it's probably not true. Of course, these days, there are grandmothers who have PhDs in cosmology and whatever, so it goes. But you know what I mean.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
it should be it should be understandable to just about anybody. And if it can't be made explainable, there might be something seriously wrong with the idea.
Mm.
Mhm.
So we have this. So really quick, just to give people an idea here of the importance, or you gave an idea of the importance here. This is a source of energy in the body, but
Yes.
there are things in our environment that are really wreaking havoc on our water battery. So
Yep.
can you talk a little bit about what destroys it and then things to do to help it? Like how does a person really stay hydrated?
Okay. Well, so one thing at a time.
Yeah.
First, the system of hydration and what the environment does, and then if I forget to answer the second question about how you stay hydrated, please ask me again.
Okay.
I sometimes I start like the trunk of the tree and I go off on a branch and then a twig and whatever, and I forget where I started. But okay, so why first is this water that's inside the cell, the easy water. And by the way, easy water, negatively charged. That's why the cell is negatively charged. It has nothing to do with pumps or channels. It's very simple. The cell is filled with easy water, which has negative charge. And so now how does the cell get filled with easy water? Well, the cell is, it's got macromolecules inside the cell. It's absolutely packed with so many macromolecules, proteins, nucleic acids, whatever. And the surfaces are mostly charged or hydrophilic. So any water that's inside the cell will gradually or quickly grow into easy water. So the cell gets filled up with negatively charged easy water. And that's why the cell is negatively charged. The complementary positively charged water gets pushed out of the cell. So the cell remains with easy water. And so what builds the easy water, what nucleates it, starts the growth, are these surfaces of the macromolecules. Now, if you have some contaminant from outside, that contaminant, if it destroys or if it changes the DNA and creates mutations, those surfaces are not necessarily able to nucleate the growth of easy water. So then you have less easy water. And if you have less easy water, the cell can't undergo its transition. The cell needs to, the water, I'm sorry, there are several steps along the way. What the water does, if the water is in the easy state, it's sort of a little bit like ice, and nothing can happen inside of ice. It needs to undergo a transition. And in the previous book to the one that you showed, the book that
The cells gels,
and the engines of life. Yeah,
right?
I spent half the book describing perhaps a half dozen different cell types where the evidence is that the water undergoes a transition. So the water starts like if you consider a muscle cell in the relaxed state, the muscle cell, the water is Gilbert Ling would say structured water, we'd say easy or fourth phase water, but nothing happens. But if the cell needs to do something, like if it's a muscle cell that needs to contract, then the entire cell undergoes a so-called phase transition where the water is structured and the proteins are in their extended state. And then when the cell is triggered, the muscle cell again, triggered to contract, everything changes. The water changes, it undergoes a transition from structured easy water to ordinary liquid water. And that is what allows the proteins to undergo their change and to create the contraction itself, after which everything returns to the initial state. Now, if you don't, if you have environmental factors that impact the DNA, then those surfaces of those proteins and other macromolecules are mutated, they're changed. They don't necessarily have the capacity to nucleate the growth of easy water. So the cell then doesn't have as much easy water. And you can tell that because the electrical potential will be, the magnitude will be smaller. And if it doesn't have that easy water, which needs to undergo a transition to ordinary liquid water, there's less of a transition that's occurring, and therefore the action will be weaker. So if you want full activity, you have no mutations, and the easy water undergoes a transition to ordinary water. But if you have mutations that occur as a consequence of environmental factors, then there's not as much easy water in the cell because the surfaces can't nucleate the growth of easy water as well. And the transition from easy water to ordinary water is smaller, less transition, and therefore less action. And therefore, your muscle would contract more weakly, or your secretory cell won't secrete as much, or your nerve cell won't conduct as well, et cetera, et cetera. So
Is that aging you're
exactly.
describing, or chronic disease?
Well, all of the above.
All of the above.
I
Cancer.
think, I think all of the above. Yeah.
Okay.
And, especially, I guess that one of the prime examples of this is cancer cells. Cancer cells, the electrical potential of cancer cells, a wide variety of cancer cells, instead of being minus 60 or 70 or 80, it's minus 10 or 20 millivolts, which means there's less easy water in the cell. And so it turns out that the cancer cells don't have as much capacity to do whatever they're designed to do. And also the most critical feature is that if the electrical potential is really low, magnitude is low, minus 10, minus 20, minus 30, that's exactly the condition that's required for cells to divide. This has been demonstrated in many cells, not only cancer cells, but embryonic cells too. Very small magnitude electrical potential. So I think that, cancer cells might be taken as the extreme of a continuum of dysfunction or pathology. So you have if you have a full complement of easy water, you have a healthy cell. If the amount of easy water is compromised in some way, the cell is somewhat dysfunctional. If it's seriously compromised, the cell is pathological. And if it's very seriously compromised, it's cancerous. It's a continuum. It's not that each one of those is it's separate disease. And I argue that it's basically dehydration. It could be put into a simple term, dehydration, because the cell has got, if hydration is equal to easy water, if the cell has progressively less easy water, then it's progressively more dehydrated. And I would argue that cancer cells, I wrote a paper about this published last year, that cancer cells are at the extreme of dehydration. So then the second part of the question was, well, what can you do about this? What can you do about these dysfunctions? And I argue that anything you do to increase the amount of easy water in the cell will tend to reverse the dysfunction. So I can give you some examples of that. First thing is,
Please do.
oh, okay. Well, I'm happy to do so. Drink more water.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
Number one.
yeah, because the water you drink, some of the water will turn into, yeah, that's exactly right. Will turn into easy water. Some get spit out, but basically you're rehydrating by increasing the amount of easy water in the cell. And you know that know that if you've been skiing all day, taking a drink of water or playing tennis, 2 matches of tennis, sitting down and drinking a liter of water or something refreshes you, gives you energy. Another way is juicing, and you know about juicing, but not everybody does. I mean, basically, you go to your backyard, you take some freshly growing plants, you pull off the leaves, you put it into a machine that squeezes out the juice, and you drink
Like
the juice.
cucumber would be great, right?
Yeah, cucumber is very good, but even besides cucumber, there are lots of other vegetables. And what are you drinking? You're drinking the water from inside the plant cells, and that water is easy water. And if the plant is freshly grown, it's got a lot of easy water in it. And that's why many health practitioners will argue that that's the simplest thing you can do to preserve your health or improve your health, is to drink that juice on a daily basis. So that's another is sunshine. I didn't tell you this, but the agent that builds easy water is light, especially infrared light. And
Hmm.
so I know there are lots of red light therapies and infrared therapies. So, and the way they work, I would argue, is that they build easy water, and build
Right.
easy water in your cells makes you healthy. So it builds easy water in your cells, which makes your cells healthy. And the extreme of that, I guess, is the sauna, or as the Finns say, the sauna, because it's high temperature, whether it's dry or moist, it's high temperature, and the high temperature is associated with infrared. So infrared light, or at the red end of the spectrum, near infrared, builds easy water, and that's what you want in your cells. So that's why when you go into the sauna, you come out 30 minutes later and you feel like a renewed person because you're
Even though
building.
you've dehydrated, like it's not kind of a paradox. You think that you've sweat and dehydrated, but at the same time, people don't realize you're actually hydrating from the inside
You're
out.
actually you're actually hydrating. Yeah. Well, you may be dehydrating some parts of your body, but the parts that need buildup of
Mhm.
easy water are getting that buildup. Yes, you're right. There is an element of dehydration involved. That's avoided somewhat in the saunas that are moist rather than the ones that are
True.
are
True.
are dry. But anyway, that's one. And then another one is grounding or earthing. You connect yourself to the earth. And so what does that do? Well, it turns out that I didn't know this studying electrical engineering. No professor even hinted that the earth was anything but a bland neutrality. And when a Russian guy who was in my lab told me one day that, oh, you don't know that the earth is negatively charged, I said, Andre, you must be on some kind of drug. I never heard of such a thing. And he said, it's amazing because when I went to school in Russia, he's a contemporary age, slightly younger. He said everybody in Russia knew that the earth was negatively charged. And I said, I never heard of such a thing. And I went home, I was scratching my head, I had trouble sleeping. And next day, one of my students brought me the famous Feynman lectures on physics, and volume 2, chapter 9, a whole chapter devoted to evidence that the earth is negatively charged. So what does that mean? Well, it means if you connect yourself electrically to the earth, and most of us aren't connected to the earth because we wear leather shoes, so we're insulated. But if you take off your shoes and either walk on the wet grass or walk on the sand next to the ocean, we're connected electrically to the earth. And any of our cells that are missing this critical agent, the easy water, the negative charge will come in. And what negative charge does, we found in the laboratory, is that if you start with water and you add negative charge, that water transitions into easy water. So we know if electrical current flows in, you'll get easy water. So that's another way of building easy water. And then finally, or maybe not finally, there are agents, herbs of various sorts that have been known for 5,000 years or more during Ayurvedic times to be good for health. So there's like turmeric is one of them, holy basil is another, ghee, the clarified butter. And we tested a whole bunch of those, and we found that every one of them builds easy water. So if you have water and you add, say, turmeric in the right concentration, the easy will build to a larger size. You get more easy water in the presence of some of those agents, or essentially all of those agents. And on the other side, if we took a poison like glyphosate, for example,
Mm. Thank you for
uh,
mentioning.
yeah, and every concentration it diminished the amount of easy water. So
Wow.
that's to be expected of a poison, and we don't know about other poisons. I've been a little bit reluctant to ask some of the students to deal with the poisons because I don't want someone to die of exposure. You know what I mean? So, but at any rate, it appears it's possible that many of these poisons act by dehydration.
Ah.
And
Speaking of like dehydration, we can, in our studies, we've kind of come across blue light and then non-native EMFs like like cell phones and routers being dehydrating. Have you tested those at all?
Yes, we did. We have tested, and the cell phone issue we tested. So there was a student in the lab, and he took a router and put a router next to one of these chambers that were used to study EZ growth. And when he turned on the router, the EZ size diminished by some 20%. We never published it, and the reason we never published it is somehow that student disappeared. I don't know whatever happened to him, but completely out of contact, and nobody has been able to contact him. And I don't know what happened. He was a really popular student, very friendly, and he seemed to be doing good work, but I'm kind of reluctant to publish a result where I don't have access to the person who actually did the experiment. So, but for what it's worth, we found that the EZ size diminished in the presence of electromagnetic
Of a route, at least a router.
router. Yeah. So this is one more that I want to mention because I think it's really important. You know, hyperbaric oxygen therapy. I had a student after he or postdoc after he finished in my lab, he went to work for a company building and testing hyperbaric oxygen chambers. And as you know, these chambers, you get into the chamber, and the air that you breathe is done under high pressure and high oxygen. And we wondered because these machines have high efficacy for so many different syndromes, not only the original of wound healing, which they were very effective, but for many, many syndromes, including cancer, they're used. And so we wondered, is there something magical about high oxygen and high pressure? And we tested it and we published it, and we found that high pressure builds EZ and high oxygen builds EZ. When you put the two together, you get a major EZ buildup. And so it's possible that the reason that hyperbaric oxygen therapy is so successful for so many different syndromes is basically it builds EZ. So anyway, I've given you a half dozen or so different expedients that can be used, and they're used effectively. And I would argue that the buildup of EZ is a generality that you can improve whatever dysfunction you have. I say whatever, you know, I'm exaggerating somewhat because I don't know if it's everyone, but I think there's a generality. And I think that generality is that your cells, well, it doesn't matter whether it's a muscle cell or a nerve cell or pancreatic cell or whatever ever kind of cell, if it doesn't have enough EZ water, it's not going to function properly. And the lesser the amount of EZ water, the more pathological the cell will be. So what you really want to do is you want to apply any one of those expedients that I mentioned, and these expedients will, to some extent or more extent or whatever, build EZ water and tend to reverse that kind of pathology.
Mhm.
So I think
Okay.
that's a kind of bottom line that is really important. I'm I'm working right now on a paper that will describe that. Wish I
Well,
had time is the
well,
issue.
we are so thankful for the time you're giving us today because this is clarifying so much. I used to spend a little time in hypobaric. I think they were hypobaric chambers.
Hyperbaric, right? Yeah.
Well, to fly up in an F-18 in the Air
Oh,
Force,
oh, oh.
we had to learn what our hypoxic symptoms were. So now
Yeah.
I'm thinking, well, I think they probably lowered my EZ. Maybe I
Well,
should have got
I might
danger
have.
pay for that.
Well, how did you feel when you were up there?
Oh, exhilarating. It was incredible. I had two F-18 rides in my time, and it was the most exciting 2 hours of my life. But in the chamber, you don't feel good at all. Like when they take away the oxygen and you start to get silly, you know.
Oh
And
my goodness. Did you by any chance fly upside down?
oh yes, yeah. My first F-18 ride was a 1 hour dogfight, actually.
Oh,
Against my husband who was doing an upgrade mission, and it was the most exciting, like I say, hour of my life. I was actually when we came into landing, I was actually a little relieved at the final, at the very end. I could do a whole podcast episode on how exciting that was.
I
But
bet it was. So, could you ever explain about flying upside down? If Bernoulli's principle is,
but is it true that you're writing a book on this?
I've written a
Or
book. It's at the
you've written a
print
book?
right now, and it will be out in 6 weeks or so.
Oh
Oh,
my goodness.
wow.
Called Charged, and
Charged.
I deal with planes flying, and I deal with birds flying, and a host of other subjects that we think we understand, but I argue that we really don't. And the real explanation differs from the accepted explanation. So in the case of planes, well, they do fly upside down, and there are some birds that fly upside down too. So invoking the Bernoulli principle doesn't always work.
Mm,
And some planes don't have that classic curvature. The more modern planes are flatter. The wings are flat on top.
hmm.
There's some hobby planes that are completely flat and they fly just perfectly. So I think it's not Bernoulli's principle. I think it's something else. And I guess I don't want to give it away right now, but please take a look on Amazon. And if you're interested, I deal with a whole lot of subjects, including what's the nature of gravitation, the real nature of gravitation, because the idea that one mass attracts another seems to work most of the time, but not always. It doesn't work. For example, some measurements show a periodic variation in the gravitational constant that varies every 24 hours. Another one shows that it's different in the summer from the winter. And 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 there are observations like that that simply don't make sense in the standard paradigm. So you need to think about maybe something else that might explain these observations a little bit better. A whole lot of observations like, I don't know, either of you do sailing?
I do.
Yeah. Do you know about ice boats?
No.
Uh,
Oh, breaking through the ice or no?
no, no,
Not sailboats, but
there's sailboats that run on ice. So you don't have a keel that runs through the water, so you don't
right.
have the complications imposed by the water viscosity. It runs on skids that run on the top of the ice, just like a sled.
I'm
But
thinking of kites. Is it kite surfing? I've seen them do it on our lake on the snow, on the ice with a
yeah,
sail. Yeah.
I think that's probably the same, right? They're called
Mm.
ice boats, and they can head almost directly into the wind. So in other words, I'm blowing on your face and you're moving toward me instead of away from me. If you think about that, I
Yeah.
mean, it sounds impossible, right?
Yeah, normally you tack, at like 45 degrees,
Yeah, but
right?
those boats don't need to tack. They can go up to 5 or 6 degrees off the wind, almost directly into the wind at
Okay.
100 miles an
Interesting.
hour. And it's just that it's easier if you think about those boats, the physics and mathematics is easier because there are no angles involved. You go directly, almost directly into the wind. But if you think about it, it doesn't make sense because if I'm blowing on your nose and your face, you're going to want to move backwards, not toward me,
Right.
right? But the boats move toward me and
Hmm.
really fast. So how does that work? Well,
Yeah, how does that? That's crazy. In
well,
this book, do you happen to do your theory of the atom? I heard you in a summit talk about it just briefly.
no, that's
Is
the
this
next book.
included, or is that a whole nother book?
Next book. And my son, who's the artist, who's a fantastic artist, he's taking a break of 2 weeks because we just sent the book to the printer, the charge book, and the atom book will be next. He's got half the
Okay.
drawings done already. So I think it
Oh,
won't be more than 6 or 8 months before it's ready to be published, I hope.
Okay. Can you give us a little teaser on your theory, or do you have to wait?
Well, I'll give you, I guess I can, yeah, I can give you a little teaser. So, first of all, I've learned, we've all learned about the so-called solar system model.
Hmm.
Where, you've got a nucleus, and the nucleus contains protons and neutrons, right? And then orbitals that contain electrons. So, first question, and we all believe that that's true, but I'm raising a question whether indeed that can be true. So think about the nucleus. nucleus contains neutrons and protons and subatomic particles, but let's let them aside for the moment. Protons have positive charge, right? Neutrons
Mhm.
are neutral.
Mhm.
Now, if you pack positive charges together, what do they want to do?
They're going to repel?
Right. And that so the nucleus wants to explode.
Yeah.
Okay. So the physicists realized that this is a problem. And so I hesitate to use the word invented, but I guess there's no other word for it. They invented something because there's no independent evidence. Something called a strong force. That's what they call it, a strong force. And it's like a glue that holds the nucleus together. It keeps it from exploding. Now, you can say, well, oh yeah, okay, that's all right, but absent independent evidence for the existence of a strong force with those particular characteristics, you have to ask the question whether that's merely a band-aid to cover up a gaping wound. So, I
Mm.
mean, this is a problem, but there's more. You learned, I bet you, I learned in middle school that plus and minus attract each other, right?
Mhm.
Yeah. Okay. Nucleus is positive. The electrons that run around in orbitals are negative. Now, if minus attracts to positive, how come all those electrons that are running around the nucleus don't collapse onto the nucleus, reducing the atom to just a point?
Right. We're told that it's like the circle and then the
Yeah,
right.
exactly. Yeah,
And you're saying those electrons would not be able to stay on those orbits. It would just go,
absolutely.
okay.
There's
Well,
no
that makes
consequence.
complete sense.
Yeah, well, yeah. So, you have to ask a question. Well, if there's no if there's no easy interpretation of that, then maybe the model is wrong. We don't we don't consider that there's a possibility that the model could be wrong because
Hmm.
everybody believes for 5 generations, that the model is correct. And we start with the assumption of the correctness of the model. But how do we know it's correct? Has anybody ever seen the nucleus or have seen electrons or seen electrons existing in orbitals? Why would electrons want to stick in the same orbital? They repel each other. They want to get as far away from each other as possible. So why do they stick close to one another in orbitals? So another question. My computer is built of aluminum, right? It means that aluminum atoms stick together. Otherwise, I wouldn't have a solid computer, right? Every aluminum atom likes to stick to every other aluminum atom. But if you look at the structure, each aluminum atom has a negative charge on the outermost orbital. So this one has, and this one has. And so the two atoms, if that model is correct, they would repel each other, not stick to
Right.
each other. So why would they stick to each other? Those are a few of the multiple reasons why the model doesn't work. So I came up with a different model that I think works, and it's stable. It doesn't either explode or collapse into nothingness. And I'll just say one thing about it, and that is after I finished drafting the book, which was actually quite a few years ago, it's just been sitting there because my son takes his time illustrating. So it takes a while. He's worth it. He's
It's
amazing.
tough to get those kids to do
No,
what we want
he's
when
there.
we want.
He is absolutely conscientious, but he's persistent. Every diagram has to be just right. And so
Ah,
I'm ahead of him in the writing, but it's coming.
what
It's
a team.
yeah. Oh, it's wait till you see the charge book, which is coming out
Oh,
soon. The figures are just glorious. They're
Awesome.
just amazing, and he's so easy to work with. It's great. Anyway, after I drafted the book, gone through some rounds of editing, I discovered that someone else came up with a model not too different from mine, and this was 100 years ago. It was the model is called the Bohr model because
mhm.
Bohr was the guy who
Niels.
Niels Bohr, right,
Right,
and
right.
from Copenhagen, came up with the model. And the chemists hated it. The chemists, the physicists loved it because it was the era of physics, all the great physicists winning Nobel Prizes. And the chemists hated it because they said there were a couple of super famous chemists. One is Irving Langmuir, and the other is G.N. Lewis. Langmuir won a Nobel Prize, I think, and Lewis was the kind of dean of chemistry or something like that at Berkeley. And these were two of the leaders in the field. And they said, this Bohr model is nonsense. It doesn't explain the simplest of chemical reactions. And many of the chemists agreed that this is nonsense. I'm not sure if they still agree, but they agreed. So I discovered notes from G.N. Lewis, and his notes, just outlined in pencil or pen, were reproduced. And the model that Lewis came up with is almost the same as the model that I've come up with. That was 100
Oh,
years ago. So I didn't know about it. I found out after I derived mine. So that gave me a bit of confidence that maybe I was kind of on the right track. So, and the model, without going into detail, because it's hard to do it without some diagrams and enough time to do it. But I think the model is a cubic model rather than a spherical model. When you have a spherical model, and you put two atoms together, you have dead space. You can't fit two spheres together. There's always space
Right.
outside of the spheres. It's
Oh,
undefined.
yeah.
But if you have platonic solids like cubes, they fit together very nicely. So I think it's largely a cubic model with some exceptions. And please wait for the book and have a look at the book, and you can make judgment yourself as to whether you think the proposed model is more, shall we say, meaningful than the other, despite the fact that the other has been around for 5 generations. We'll see.
Okay. Awesome. Well, we're excited for it. We're coming up on our time now. I know that Laura had wanted to bring up
Oh,
something about the,
so many things I wanted to ask. Oh,
well,
we'll have to give up a
what do
bunch.
you have for time, Jerry?
Well, I've got a few minutes.
A few minutes. Okay. So, and then we'll get to our signature question right after. So one thing you want to bring up, Laura, which one?
Oh, I did want to ask about any research you've done with deuterium depleted water. It's probably
We just completed a study.
you
The
did.
Okay.
paper is written, and I'm
Excellent.
waiting for a
Okay.
student who did the hands-on work to submit it for publication. We found
Okay.
that deuterium depleted water builds bigger EZs than ordinary water. And it fits with the idea that you're better off, well, better hydrated, better functioning, if you have bigger EZs, because that's what we found deuterium depleted water does. We were hoping to get a result that gave us the size of the EZ as a function of the percent of deuterium depleted water, but the results were more scattered than that. But we found in easily statistically significant fashion that when you've got when you have deuterium depleted water, you get bigger EZs. So
Okay.
at least know that. We don't know about the quantitative determination of that. That remains for the future. But
Okay.
at least that's what we found out. So
Int-
it fits with the idea that, deuterium depleted water seems to be good for health.
Yeah, this might be a stupid question, but isn't easy water in itself deuterium depleted?
No, well, we don't know. We start off with water that contains deuterium, so
Okay.
we can presume that there is some deuterium in the lattice. Really, we're talking about a lattice that forms,
Hmm.
an easy lattice, and that's going to have mostly protium and some deuterium. And deuterium is like it's kind of like a something of a contaminant, and it we expect it to kind of disrupt the growth of the EZ. Because when you've got something that's included in EZ that's not the same as every other component that's contained in it, it's kind of like a contaminant, and the contaminants will inhibit the growth of the lattice. But if you get rid of the contaminant, in other words, get rid of the deuterium, then that's going to facilitate the growth of EZ, not compromise it. And
Hmm.
so it kind of fits with what we expect. And I'm glad we found that result. So I'm looking forward to publication of it.
Yeah. I bet there's so many people listening that are too, including ourselves. So our signature question that we want to ask you is, what does healthy science mean to you?
Healthy science means the absence of fear of asking the most fundamental questions that exist in science. You start with a foundation and you build on the foundation. And I guess you might consider the foundation to be the atomic structure, for example. You build on that. And if you start with the wrong atomic structure, you're going to build on a foundation that's not sound.
Right.
And if you build on a foundation that's not sound, everything's going to be complicated. And right now, science looks very complicated. And my own thought is science is not very complicated. Mother Nature builds simple systems. And the reason it may look complicated is you're starting with a foundation that's not correct. So I didn't start out that way, but I've now had enough experience to realize that many concepts that we have are actually wrong. And if you look into it and you actually look at the evidence, the amount of evidence that fits and evidence that doesn't fit, it turns out, if you're careful and look conscientiously, you find a lot of evidence that doesn't fit. And in many cases, which means you can either sweep it under the carpet and say, well, it's good enough. Or you can say, well, there's enough evidence that doesn't fit that I'm going to look deeply myself and find out what's the real evidence. And the atomic structure that you brought up is one of those. If you start with the wrong structure, then that everything in chemistry is going to be, you might say, wrong. I hesitate to use so blatant a term, but it's going to turn out to seem more complicated than actually it is. So,
Hmm.
but if you start and you find out what is the real atomic structure and you got the right answer, I'm not saying we have the right answer. I'm hoping that we're headed in the right direction, and you build from that foundation, then science should turn out to be simple, straightforward. And that's my goal, is to start at the most foundational level and build from there, and winding up with a science that's not only simple but beautiful, because beauty and simplicity, I think, go together. So I guess that's my message right now. As you know, it's not easy to dig into the most fundamental concepts because you need money to do whatever you're doing, and it's hard to get money. If you say, "Hey, give me some money because I want to study the structure of the atom," well, your reviewers will think that they know what the structure of the atom is,
Right.
and don't bother us with that. And we're not going to give you money for doing so stupid a kind of endeavor, which means any scientist who's, shall we say, intelligent won't pursue a question like that because they know that what's going to happen is they won't get money. They'll get a reputation as being a kind of crazy maverick who's on some kind of drug, you know, and and you'll quickly disappear from the scientific scene because if you can't get any money, you can't do anything, you lose your academic position, et cetera, et cetera. So you have to be a little bit crazy, like maybe I am, in order to have interest in pursuing something really fundamental. But that's exactly what we need if we want to make progress.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Well, oh my gosh, you're certainly part of the paradigm shift we find ourselves in. So hopefully, yeah, you're giving us so much hope today.
well, thank you. I appreciate that.
So much hope.
Yeah.
Jerry, how can people find you if they want to look, see where your research papers are? Can you mention quickly the water conference that you do
Yeah,
and
I mean that
the
that
Institute
that
for
is
Venture
one.
Science?
Yeah, so that's the URL is waterconf, water CONF, as in water conference, waterconf.org. not .com, .org.
Okay.
WaterConf, www.waterconf.org. And we're just in the process of discussing the next one, which should occur probably around October. And last year we held it in Portugal, Lisbon, and probably it'll be in Lisbon again, though we're not absolutely certain. It's a lovely city and friendly and cheaper than a lot of other cities. And anybody is welcome to come. And so that's the way to find out what's going on in the entire field. Now, if you're interested in the stuff that we do in particular, we're one of 35 presenters or so at the conference. I'm just the organizer. If you want to find out, then www.pollacklab, one word, pollacklab.org would be the place, and you can find out all the papers there. And I would recommend checking out the books because they're cheap. We keep them actually very inexpensive because the goal is dissemination, not profit. You know,
Mhm.
we actually lose money because we charge so little for the books, and the goal is to have people read the books, not necessarily
Mhm.
to make this a money making endeavor. And the books have won prizes and such, and I think they're pretty good. So I recommend that. And if you want to contact me, my email address is all over the internet. No problem finding me.
All
Sometimes
right.
I'm a little oversubscribed, you know.
And the Institute of Venture Science, can you mention that
Yeah,
just quickly?
sure. That's IV Science is the
Ivy Science.
URL. ivscience.org. www.iv as in
Okay.
intravenous,
Okay.
ivscience.org. And there you can find, I'm actually quite proud of this
Hmm.
institute because, it provides a way for people to actually get funded for unorthodox ideas.
Mhm.
It's almost impossible to get funded for unorthodox ideas in the mainstream because what they do is, if you, for example, if you assert that the earth is round and everybody else knows that the earth is flat, you write a grant proposal to study what you propose to be the round earth, and the gatekeeper who receives your application says, "Oh, I don't never heard of this person. I better recruit the world's expert on the shape of the earth to see whether this person is a flake or otherwise." So the person you're challenging is the one who's reviewing your proposal. And there's no way you're going to get funded, or almost impossible to get funded. There needs to be some other way. And the other way to get funded. And I think this is the reason why we've had so few scientific revolutions in the past 50 years or so. There have been plenty of technological revolutions like Zoom, and
That's true.
iPhones. Yeah, yeah. But can you think of anything in the past 50 years that's comparable, say, to the discovery of the genetic code or the splitting of the atom or something like this, all of which took place?
Some may say the cell phone,
Yeah, well, that's
but
technology, right?
technology. Okay, right.
Yeah, and there's plenty of money to support technology because you
Mhm.
invest the money and you get rewards, financial rewards from it. You take a risk, but it's a good risk. It's not the same for fundamental science, right? There's no
Mhm.
financial reward that comes at the end. So it's really difficult. And I would actually challenge you to think of a real scientific revolution of that magnitude that's impacted everybody's life, not that promises to impact everybody's life, but has already impacted everybody's life, something that took place in the past, say, 50 years. Very few. And the reason I would argue is that it's not possible to get money to study ideas that challenge mainstream views or that propose something radical. You just can't get the money. So that's what the Institute for Venture Science is designed to do. We need donations because it hasn't been possible to get money from the government, although that might change with the new administration. Not so clear because, RFK Jr., controversial guy, but he has he has interest. He has interest in ideas that are non-mainstream, some of which could maybe work out to create revolution. So don't know if it's going to happen, but it could happen.
Cross our fingers.
Well, I'd like to see it happen. So I hope I've presented enough controversial material.
You have, and thank you so much, Jerry,
So
for
much.
joining us. Thank you, thank you. And
We're just gonna raise our glasses here
yeah,
because we wanted to do this with water. And thank you for being so curious, all the continued dedication to science, challenging all the long-held ideas, including, Ling, and bringing to life his work. And it just seems like you're such a humble person, but you've accomplished so much with, I don't know how many papers we think it was 300, but it's probably even more than that. And all the
A lot of
books,
papers. Yeah.
a lot of
A lot of
papers.
papers. Yeah.
But and truly now this last piece that you've mentioned with the Institute of Venture Science, that may just produce fundamental breakthroughs for today's seemingly intractable problems like cancer and chronic disease.
I
And
hope so.
I also just want to say, just know people are reading your books.
Yeah.
Have the faith, and you gave us ideas. I know my husband's a test pilot, and he's going to be getting charged
Oh,
for his
well,
birthday.
I hope so. I'd be curious to find out what he thinks. Yeah,
Well, hey, maybe he'll contact you. We'll get
Sure.
you guys connected.
absolutely. Okay. Anyway,
Cheers, Dr. Pollack. Thank you so much.
cheers to you. Okay.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
thank you everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for sticking around to the end of this podcast. We want to thank our sponsor, Viva Rays, who allows for us to get this information to you. They offer top-of-the-line blue blocking glasses, which, as we know, are critical for our health these days for blocking artificial light at night. Over 90% of our time is spent indoors under artificial lights, and this puts us all prone to circadian rhythm disruption. You can use the code QuantumHealthy for a discount. Link is in the show notes.
Thank you so much for listening to the Quantum Healthy podcast. We hope you found some value in this information. And if you feel inspired, please share it and leave us a 5-star review. This will help us reach so many more people. If you want to connect with Laura, you can find her at laurakistmanwellness.com and Endia at endiaray.com. Links are below in the show notes. Now, go find some sunlight and embrace your own quantum healthy.